We now have the pleasure of being joined by Terry Foy of Inside Lacrosse. You may have heard him on the Lacrosse preview show on WAER back before the season. Now we've got him during the season. Terry, how are you?
I'm doing well. It's the peak, right? We're on the downside. We had midseason last week. Now we're in, basically the rush to Selection Sunday and Memorial Day. So there's literally no better time of year for sure.
Each team with dreams of Memorial Day still alive, but one team that has seen its Memorial Day dreams slow down, I'd say, a tad bit, especially after this past weekend, is Syracuse men's lacrosse, who we focus on this podcast. So, from a national perspective, Terry, what do you think of Syracuse through 11 games? What have you seen? What are maybe some things you haven't seen that you wanted to see? What is the national outlook on the Orange?
Well, let me apologize if this is boring, but my main response is that they have met my expectations positively and negatively within the smallest margin. And what I mean by that is, I had them in the 21, 22, 23 range in the preseason, and I have them there right now. And, we spoke a fair amount about the schedule and the role that that was going to play in how this season unfolded. And they have performed exactly to that schedule in the sense that, they've competed mightily against the most significant opponents on their schedule, and they've fallen short in each of those games. Every team ranked ahead of them. And then, conversely, they've taken care of business in the 6 games against the teams that were ranked behind them. So, there have been a little bit of like fits and starts, I guess I would say. Particularly they were held to 7 goals by Vermont, and then exploded in the subsequent 2 games. You've seen, in terms of at least the Vermont versus Albany game, that kind of hold the form. The way that that unfolded in terms of those two common opponents playing each other. So I think that the probably aspect of this team that has surprised me the most is I was very focused on how fatigue was potentially going to wear them down when they got to this point of the season. But they have done because they were relying on so many freshmen in key roles. But I think they've done a really nice job rotating guys. And whether in some instances, maybe it was because of an injury replacement for, a couple games or more. Generally speaking, they seem pretty fresh, even though they let up a significant run after the controversial play in the fourth quarter against Notre Dame. I don't think that was attributable to fatigue. I think it was attributable to the faceoff X. So, again, in pretty much every way, I expected that they were going to move the ball better and that they were going to score more goals. And I think that they have done both those things. I expected that at the defensive end, they were going to get more stops by virtue of their goalie, and that they were going to be more cohesive and more athletic on the perimeter defensively. And I think that you've seen that as well. And then I think as a team overall, I think they play with a compete level and a ambition that is impressive, and it sets the table for success in subsequent years. But ultimately, there just isn't enough that's part of this group right now, either experience wise or talent wise, in order to get them over the hump in that clear top 10, top 15 level team. And so here they sit, just outside the top 20.
You mentioned that Syracuse is a very young team. You got some talented freshmen, Finn Thompson, Joey Spallina, just to name a few. You also got goaltender Will Mark, first team midseason All-American. Sam Alexo plays both close D and can go in transition. Who is one or two of your favorite players to watch on this Syracuse squad?
Ooh, that's a great question. So let me answer it in 2 ways. One way is just in terms of the way that you asked it. And I think it's kind of when they're doing their job, like who stands apart the most. And, I think that it probably is Sam Alexo. I mean, his versatility, as you described it, the tenacity, the edge that he plays with, he's the best known quantity. He's the guy that you can rely on. Obviously, Will Mark has had a tremendous season, and that's not to sell short the consistency that he brought to the table. But even still, he didn't play in the fall, and so as a result, it was reasonable to have some questions around what he was going to look like this spring, and certainly he's met or exceeded every expectation for him. But I also think that there's like another type of or favorite player, so to speak, and I think that it comes in 2 ways. So the first is I love Jackson Burtwissel's game for how improved he has been and how, what he's been able to contribute relative to what, maybe people would have expected out of him coming into this season. He was kind of the forgotten man in many respects. And then Brandon Aviles, particularly early in the season, I felt like he provided the emotional spark and the stability that you need out of a short stick D midi, and that this team very clearly was going to need out of him on the basis of who else they were going to rely on at that position and in that role, by providing that combination of I've been here before, and so, follow me, right, on a team where they were going to rely on a lot of guys who hadn't been there before. And then also in terms of, that just kind of tough-nosed, on-ball, confrontational spirit that I think he's very clearly brought to the table.
So you mentioned the schedule earlier, how Syracuse has, won the games it needed to, but in the games against teams that are better than them, the Orange have come up close but haven't gotten over the hump. So do you think that those performances where they've been close but haven't gotten there are indicative that maybe a breakthrough is coming in this final stretch of the season, or that the fatigue you were referencing earlier might set in and these games might turn into blowouts?
It kind of depends on what your expectations are for the Princeton Carolina game. I think that they can win either or both of those games. Now, what does that actually mean? Princeton doesn't look like the team that made it to the Final Four last year. North Carolina is also a border. I mean, this week they were pretty securely in the top 20, but in prior weeks they had been a borderline top 20 team as well. So from that lens, are those wins at the level of Duke, Virginia, Notre Dame, Maryland, and even Hopkins? And I would say, no, they aren't. But that being said, when I rewatched the Carolina game, I watched that game live and then I went back and watched it a second time. For me, it was so indicative which team had the old guys on it, right? With North Carolina with so many fifth-year transfers, and then which team had the young guys on it. Because in those pivotal moments when one goal can turn into three, those were the sequences that went Carolina's way. For Syracuse to really feel good about what it has built so far this season, it's not just about the analytics on a per possession basis and the improvement that they have shown last year to this year. And it's also not just about the fact that they only won 4 games last year and they've won 6 this year. It's about, do you believe you can compete at the highest level, right? And I think Johns Hopkins in 21 and 22 are informative, because what they have done this year is what Syracuse wants to and would expect to do next year. Now, it certainly isn't to say that Johns Hopkins is all the way there, but I do think that the Hopkins-Syracuse game is also illustrative of the point that I'm making. When you think back to how that fourth quarter unfolded and how much confidence and moxie Johns Hopkins played with, it's actually kind of funny, because for me, I think that they earned that 2 years ago, not so much in the 22 season. And I think that the types of games, the types of plays, the type of sequences that you can unveil or experience over the course of the next 4 games, and particularly the next 2, whether or not it's enough to get you into the NCAA tournament, that is to be seen. But whether they have value next year and beyond, to me, that's inarguable. So I would say that, yes, they can win one of these next 2 games, if not both. But I don't know that that means that they are going to have made the strides that are reflective of what playing Hopkins and Duke very close would suggest that they were.
So Syracuse's next game is obviously Princeton this upcoming Saturday. They haven't played since 2013, but Syracuse and Princeton have met a bunch of times in the national championship games. What is your kind of favorite memories of the Syracuse-Princeton kind of rivalry? And then as an overall landscape of college lacrosse, what is your top rivalries right now at the moment?
Well, I'm pretty sure this is one of my favorite rivalries. I think that is, no, it definitely is. It's the 2004 you know what? I'm going to take it back. I think it's the 2004 semifinals. I think that's Princeton Navy, and then Princeton played Syracuse in the game after that on Monday. I mean, in terms of, my favorite memories of the rivalry, I believe in that 2013 meeting, Jake Vaccaro scored 8 goals or something crazy like that. If that is indeed the case, that's not my favorite memory, but that is my memory of the most recent time they played. But yeah, I would say that the Mike Powell Ryan Boyle rivalry. And I know that this was a series that had foundation that were older than that. But the fact that, Mike Powell, who we spent a lot of time talking about when Syracuse retired his jersey against Johns Hopkins, he was the number 2 recruit in that class behind Ryan Boyle. And I think that even though Mike went on to win 2 Tortons and 2 national championships, Ryan won a national championship and is still the voice of the PLL. So in many respects, it was one of those decisions that you can't. There was no wrong choice is probably the best way to put it. In terms of my favorite rivalry in the game now, I mean, I think you have to start from the default rivalries of Army Navy, Hopkins Maryland, Harvard Yale, the traditional rivalries that manifest in every sport, and think about it in the context specifically for lacrosse. When it's a lacrosse specific rivalry, this is recency and it's hard to just like get the taste out of my mouth, but I love how statistically outrageous Duke's one-sided holding over Virginia is right now. It's just so hard to wrap your head around. It doesn't make any type of logical sense. But then, there are also some rivalry games that manifest in ways where it's very clearly germane to the rosters on this current composition, the coaches, and whatever the case like that might be. 2 teams that I know have real disdain for each other that I would like to see play because they didn't play last year and they're not playing this year, and I would love to see them meet in the postseason, would be Denver and Notre Dame. There's real dislike among those 2 groups, and I would like to see that. I would like to see that manifest. So I'm sure that if I gave it more thought and had a little bit more time, I might come up with something different. But for right now, I'm going to settle on Denver Notre Dame being my favorite rivalry, and right now certainly the best rivalry that doesn't get played.
I thought you were going to go for Maryland and Virginia, considering their history over the past few seasons, the geographic location, both formerly being in the ACC, that sort of history. But Denver, Notre Dame, I like that. Not something many people would predict that I think you would say. But you mentioned Notre Dame. That's a team in the ACC that was the number 1 team in the country not too long ago. And the ACC, a league that when we talked about it before the season, you said there was the hierarchy of it was Virginia and Notre Dame at the top, then a little drop off, then Duke, and then North Carolina and Syracuse at the bottom. And right now, Duke's the number 1 team in the country. This is a group that has played really, really well. And the top 3 teams in the country, all from the ACC right now. So I guess if you look at what we talked about before the season, it's not exactly what you expected, but how surprised are you that Duke has taken this leap to be up there with Notre Dame and Virginia?
On a scale of 1 to 10, let's call it a 3.75. And the reason I say that is because they always had the talent in order to be able to be this good. I'm writing about this literally right now. I took a break in order to join your show, and really what is surprising about Duke is that they have been as consistent as they have been. And that has been the issue that has plagued this team since they were at their best, which, depending on how you feel about the 2021 season, you might go as far back as 2018 when they lost in the national championship game to Yale for saying that, that was kind of the last best Duke team. And then prior to that, obviously 2013 and 14 and going all the way back to 2010 when they won their first national championship. So, Duke is a really consistent program in a couple of ways. They're always going to have a high RPI. Even last year, they had a really high RPI. And they're almost never going to be ranked number 1 because they're going to lose a couple games. And I think missing the NCAA tournament last season did change a little bit about their approach, not as much as I think they expected it to in the immediate aftermath, such as not playing all the games in February on short rest that they typically do against opponents who come in on long rest and are basically playing their national championship game. They still chose to do that. They tweaked it a little bit. It wasn't, as many Friday, Sunday, games as they had played in prior years. The difference is this year that they haven't stepped back. They haven't stubbed their toe with the exception of the road loss to Jacksonville, which still stands out as being a little bit head scratching, not from the standpoint of Jacksonville isn't good enough to beat them, but because of the fact that they lost to Jacksonville in 22. So they should have had the revenge factor, and they were only 2-0. It wasn't as if they were so far removed from the memory of missing the NCAA tournament that they could have taken for granted, the fact that this Dolphins team was going to give them their best shot. So I think for me, you can look at it 2 ways: the tactics and the schemes, or you can look at it from the motivation and the emotional. I think we just kind of covered a lot about the motivation and the emotional. I think that this team has managed to, after, stubbing its toe in February, refocused, and played with intent every week. I think tactically, there's not a ton that is considerably different, with the exception of Andrew McAdory moving from midfield to attack and the role that he fills in terms of facilitating the rest of that offense and how well suited he is for that. At the defensive end, there isn't as substantial of a personnel change. Obviously, Wilhelm is in goal after Mike Adler had been holding it down for the prior 2 years. But what it really comes down to is just ratcheting it up 10, 15%, tightening it up, just being more focused in order to be more consistent. And I think that when you actually try to dive into the film or talk about the individual player performances or even some of the schematic and tactical choices that the coaches have made, you kind of come up empty, because it does feel pretty similar to what we saw last year, again, with the exception of what McAdory brings to that offense in a facilitator role. So when you take that and you say that's not enough to describe or explain the differences in what we saw last year and in 2021 versus what we saw this year, then I think everything else kind of comes down to that small margin, 10 to 15% tightening that could be attributable either to some of those edge schematic choices, or they could be attributable to the emotional edge that comes away from missing last year's NCAA tournament.
So obviously, like Ethan said, the ACC has number 1, 2, and 3, but the Big Ten, they're all ranked. The Ivy League has Cornell at 4. Princeton is in there as well. Do you think that the ACC overall, from top to bottom, is the best league in the country right now?
I guess we would have to see Syracuse play Michigan in order to be able to answer that question, if you want to ask from top to bottom. I guess actually, no, it's not even Michigan now. It's Rutgers, because they're the team that's 0-2 in the league. Yeah, I mean, does the Big Ten get an advantage for having an extra team? I don't know if you were to take Rutgers' talent and distribute it across the other 5 teams and then put each of the 5 Big Ten teams, square them off against each other, would I pick the Big Ten to go 3-2? Yeah, probably. I think actually, you know what? No, I wouldn't. So yes, to answer your question, I'm sorry, this is like the 4th question I've answered in 2 ways. The top 3 in the ACC are better than the top 3 in the Big Ten, but top to bottom, the Big Ten is better than the ACC.
Would you say it's likelier, though, that the ACC has the national champion than the Big Ten just because of that high level talent?
I would. Yeah. I mean, I do think that because what we've seen so far, even in terms of the 3-card Monty or 4-card Monty, now that Duke beat Virginia, between Notre Dame, Virginia, Maryland, and the Blue Devils. But then before you even, really start to discount Cornell and how much better they might be able to get over the course of the rest of the season, or, some teams that don't have the postseason success but have shown, that they can beat good teams this year, like a Villanova. You come back to this notion, I think we're seeing it in the NBA right now, a historic height or a historically large number of teams that can actually win a championship. And I think that is the case for Division I men's lacrosse as well. It might end up, Duke, Maryland, Notre Dame, and Virginia qualify for or advance to the Final Four. And, everybody saw this coming. This was no surprise. And nobody outside of that group of 4 teams could realistically have won a championship. And if that is indeed the case, then ultimately what it means is that it was a normal year. But, I think that when you compound the fact that now Michigan and Loyola have wins over Maryland, and I think Maryland pretty securely and certainly on the basis of, last week's poll, had a position among that top 4, and then, kind of parlay that forward, I think that there's a realistic argument that, maybe there are 5, 6, 7, 8 teams that could, if not just advance to the Final Four, but win the whole thing. And if that is indeed the case, certainly on the heels of a year in which we had a historically good Maryland team, but, even relative to most normal years where you would probably think the number of potential contenders is between 3 and 5, we might end up looking back on it and saying, there were actually more teams that could win the 2023 NCAA championship than there usually are.
Focusing back on Syracuse a little bit, we talked to Rick Beardsley last week just about kind of the rebuild that Syracuse is going through right now. And obviously this year hasn't gone as they've planned. They haven't gotten a ranked win. They've won the games that they were supposed to. But at the moment, do you see Syracuse trending towards getting back to that national stage that they're used to in men's lacrosse?
Yes. I think that if they just continue on an organic trajectory, and what I mean by that specifically is without the infusion of some really talented players through the transfer portal, I think next year they would probably be ranked between 12 and 16 in the preseason rankings. I think that with some of the talent that is and will be available in the transfer portal, that will take a serious look at Syracuse. I think it's possible that they could bump up to a, say, 5 to 11 range. I think that Gary Gait is a relatively unique coach to play for. And I think that it takes a lot of time to learn his nuances and derive the benefits from everything that he brings to the table. And essentially what I'm saying is that, like, he's kind of a Jedi in the sense that, you know, he can almost like transmit thoughts to you without actually saying it.
I think that's an awesome word. Just by watching him on the sidelines, just how he coaches, his assistant coaches are screaming and yelling, and he's just standing there, not doing anything.
It's funny because, you know, I never played for him, and I wouldn't even say that I know him very well. I encounter him 3-4 times a year, and when I do, we have great conversations. But I have had two members of my staff in Hallie Quillinan and now Alyssa Murray who have played for him for, you know, respectively, I believe 3 and 4, or maybe 4 and 4 years. And, you know, they were the lefty attacker that wore number 1 on his teams, right? So, you know, he had an even more kind of acute understanding of the role that they were supposed to fill and kind of relationship to them. And, you know, whenever we talk about, so and now they've worked here inside Lacrosse for collectively like almost 10 years or 10 years, whatever. And so I've had 10 years worth of conversations about what it's like to play for Gary Gait with people who I talk to literally every single day. And whenever the conversation starts, it always starts the same way. They laugh. And then it moves into oh, that's just Gary. And there's this kind of unexplainable and almost, if you didn't play for him, it seems ununderstandable dynamic that emerges where, if I were to try to explain it only based on assumptions coming away from these conversations, what I would say is he coaches in the office Monday through Friday, right? He doesn't even really coach that much on the practice field. He coaches by virtue of, like, essentially how you would expect one of the best players of all time to coach, which is as a teammate. And, you know, Gary Gait can't tell you to do the things the way he did them. He knows that you are not capable of doing it on the basis of your talent relative to his. But what he can do is make you believe that you're going to win because you're a part of a collective that's all going to be on the same page. They're going to be rowing the boat the same direction. And you know, they understand the stakes. Ultimately, like, you know, again, a lot of assumptions, a lot of inferences, but like, I think that Gary is the type of guy who really believes in the adage, like, nobody gets out of life alive, right? So you might as well enjoy it while you're here and not take yourself too seriously. And, you know, like, you hear about his description or his explanation coming away from the, you know, goal, no goal, Finn Thompson, Notre Dame play. And, you know, he just explains what the ref said to him, diffuses the situation, and goes about his day. And it's a reflection, in my opinion, of like a lot about the way that he leads the program. And, you know, it was going to be a dramatic shift, first of all, from John Desko to anybody. And secondly, any program that Gary took over was going to experience a dramatic shift from the way it had been run previously. And so when those two things collide, and then you do something like bring in Dave Petramala, who himself was a legendary head coach and has his own way of doing things, I think it was just going to take a lot of time in order to settle out. And so I think that there is inherent value to that time, and that the 2024 season and beyond is that time, right? And it's not just looking at what's happened, you know, up the road at Homewood and seeing a similar type of transition that was only going to be smoothed out by time come to fruition. But it is informative. And, you know, candidly, it's also not just those two places. it's pretty common as well at a lot of other places. So I see a Syracuse program that is headed on an ascendant trajectory. And I think that how quickly it ascends in 2024 and 2025 will have a lot to do with how good these incoming freshman recruits are and how talented the players that decide that Syracuse is their new home coming out of the transfer portal actually are as well.
So I guess that brings the question. We talked about these next 4 games coming up for the Orange. What are the chances that you think they could beat that trajectory and really make a run over this final month of the season and potentially push the committee to get them in the tournament?
Yeah, so it's again a two-part question, because the first part is who can they beat, and then the second part is, there are teams that are more likely for them to win, and then how good or what are the odds that those become quality wins and enough quality wins in order to actually be worthwhile. So, right now, I believe Syracuse's RPI is 27. Did I get that right from memory?
You want to check on that, Jordan?
26. 26.
Okay, 26.
So, first of all, I'm not sure that they can get up into, at-large contention, which historically is 12th or 13th, without winning 3 games. I think they might have to win 3 in order to do it. And if they do, it implies that they have beaten either one of Virginia and Notre Dame. If they beat both of them, they probably, I would assume, almost certainly will climb all the way up to 12 or 13. And they will have presumably certainly 2 top 10 wins, if not 2 top 5 wins. And if you're 2 top 5 wins, 1 additional, maybe 2 additional top 20 wins, that you're in the tournament, right? So the odds of that happening are, I don't know, less than 5% probably, in terms of beating both Notre Dame and Virginia. So what are the odds they beat both Carolina and Princeton? They're probably between 20 and 30% if you look at the betting lines and try to infer implied odds there. But again, I don't think that's enough to get them in the NCAA tournament. So now what are the odds they beat those 2 and one of Notre Dame and Virginia? It's probably between 15 and 18%. And in that scenario, it's still not certain that they would get into the NCAA tournament, because you would need Princeton and Carolina to both remain top 20 wins. Right now, Princeton's RPI is 24. So they'd have to lose to Syracuse and then win enough games in order for their RPI to become a quality win. And then Syracuse's RPI would have to get high enough in order to be an at-large consideration. They would need whichever between Notre Dame and Virginia lost to them to remain a top 5 win. And then they would need only 2 other top 20 wins to be enough to get them in. I mean, that still seems like a 30 to 40% proposition as well. So point being, they probably have to beat both Notre Dame and Virginia in order to get in. And that's probably like a 5% likelihood.
Sounds like a lot of math to me. And Syracuse probably should have, taken advantage of a couple opportunities earlier this season when they were in close games, lost in overtime to Duke, lost by 2 to Hopkins, and then were beating Notre Dame last week in the 4th quarter. Some missed opportunities, and there might not be many more coming up with the schedule. So before we let you go, who do you think, Terry, will win the national championship? As of what you've seen until today, who's your championship pick?
Virginia.
He's going with Virginia.
I kind of ran through everybody in my head, and it's funny because Virginia fans think that I hate Virginia. I just think that Cavalier team has the fewest reasons that they won't win, is probably the best way I would put it. Notre Dame's got history and, some questions around continuity. Duke, I love everything about the way they're playing. I just feel like there's another shoe that's going to drop at some point. Maryland, I just don't think they're quite good enough. So I don't want to say it's Virginia by default. I just don't really have an equivalent thing that concerns me about Virginia. So, I'm going to go with Cavaliers.
I think the thing, though, that should be exciting for everyone, as you were talking about earlier, is the parity going on and how many different teams could potentially win the championship. And that should make for a really, really really fun NCAA tournament coming up in May. All right, that's Terry Foy, CEO of Inside Lacrosse. Thank you so much again for your time and really appreciated chatting.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. Enjoyed it as well.